Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics Seminar Series. And today is our final seminar for the 2021-2022 session. My name is Angel Petropanagos, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speakers are Quinn Grundy and Daniel Buchman, and the seminar is entitled Canadian Big Cannabis Companies and the Financial Sponsorship of Scientific Research. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded, and this lecture, along with other archived lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Center for Bioethics website. The format for today is a presentation by our speakers, followed by a facilitated discussion period. Now, first of all, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Quinn Grundy is a registered nurse and is an assistant professor with the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing at the University of Toronto, and also a faculty associate with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado, Anschutz Medical Campus. Dr. Grundy's research explores the interactions and intersections between medically related industry and the public health system, health professionals and health researchers, and the implications of health information, healthcare delivery, and scientific evidence. Daniel Buchman is a bioethicist and an independent scientist in the Campbell Family Mental Health Research Institute at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where he's the director of the Everyday Ethics Lab. He's also an assistant professor in the Dalla School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, member of the University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics as well. Some of Dr. Buchman's currently funded projects explore stigma, chronic pain, neurotechnologies, cannabis, and corporate influences on mental health, ethics, and opioids, and the ethics of artificial intelligence. Quinn, Daniel, welcome. So nice to have you. Turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Angel, and wonderful to be speaking with you all at the JCB Seminar Series. And I think I understand this week is the last one of the academic year, which is bananas, but here we are. This is, I'm going to present on some preliminary findings with Dr. Grundy today of a project that we've been working on over the last several months, looking, as the title says, on some Canadian big cannabis companies and this financial sponsorship of scientific research. General issues around sponsorship of research will be familiar probably to many of you bioethics folks in the audience. Before we really get into things, I want to highlight the just incredible team that we both have the absolute privilege to work with. You can see the folks on here and who we're working closely with, and particularly I want to highlight the work today of Daphne Imahori, an extremely talented undergraduate student who's been working with us on this work, as well as Shreya Mahajan, who's been supporting this work as well. And this project today that we're speaking on was very generously funded by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So an overview for today, really high level. We're going to give a very brief background of cannabis in Canada. We're going to talk about the study and the methods that we'll use. We'll talk about our preliminary findings. This is actually, I should say, we're presenting the findings of the first phase of a two-phase project. We'll then get into some discussion and conclusions. And I know Dr. Grundy and I are excited to engage you all in discussion about what we've spoken about here. So in Canada, cannabis has been legal, as many of you are probably familiar with, since 2001 for medical purposes. However, non-medical legalization occurred in Canada in October of 2018. And since then, there's been actually some broader commercialization of cannabis that has happened since in the various provinces and territories. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Since legalization in particular, cannabis has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in many ways, this new emerging cannabis industry rivals some of its industry counterparts like big pharma, big tobacco, and big food. And what we're starting to see with an emerging cannabis industry in Canada, as well as in several US states, where cannabis has also been legalized, is that the industry is becoming increasingly dominated by big companies. These, again, multi-million, multi-billion-dollar companies. They tend to be led by white men, and as a result, end up sidelining very small-scale businesses, as well as those that are led by women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so the context of legalization and the sort of ongoing history of prohibition and criminalization in Canada is very much a part of this story that we're going to tell today. And there's been some fantastic work that has been done. Here's an example recently of a report put out by the Mental Health Commission of Canada and a professor from U of T, Dr. Kwasi Owusu-Bempah, that has looked at amplifying Black experiences in cannabis and mental health research. I encourage you all to check this out because there's some really critical, important recommendations about Black health and Black experiences with cannabis in Canada. And so, even though cannabis is legal in Canada now, as I said, since 2018, these decades-long prohibition as well as systemic racism has contributed to the disproportionate criminalization of Black and Indigenous people of color for the possession, production, and sale of cannabis. And this remains an ongoing equity-related issue. I also want to highlight actually that, in our presentation today, we're going to be talking about the financial sponsorship of the cannabis industry on research, but we are making sort of no claims and remain actually quite agnostic about cannabis itself as a substance. We're going to, I'll discuss a bit sort of the case study that we're going to be looking at, but, we acknowledge that cannabis as a substance has been used for millennia by many cultures across globally for different reasons and holds different medicinal as well as cultural meanings and significance. And many people report a lot of benefits of consuming cannabis. We're not going to talk about that here today. We're going to really focus our remarks and our study actually on the financial sponsorship piece. Just to really give you a sense of the Canadian cannabis industry, these are just examples of just some major industry players in Canada. And this is coming from a Deloitte report. And so, since legalization happened in 2018, when Canada actually became the first G20 country to legalize non-medical cannabis, the industry has absolutely exploded in terms of sales. You have capital expenditures. So you're getting tons of cannabis-related farms, various processors. We've seen, at least in the province of Ontario, a wide expansion of retail outlets, employment within the cannabis industry, as well as of tax revenues. And so you can just see here, been over $11 billion in sales since legalization, not quite about 3.5 years ago, right? So, we have, hundreds of licensed producers, thousands of, retail outlets. So this is a major industry. And as I mentioned, in many ways, the Canadian cannabis industry is rivaling its industry counterparts like big pharma, tobacco, and food. I also just want to make a brief distinction here between legalization and commercialization that we're going to talk about. So after legalization in 2018, initially there were, in provinces like Ontario, there were actually fairly strict limits on the number of retail stores that could operate in the province. Later on, these were removed. And this study, which actually quite a neat time series, an interrupted time series analysis that came out a few months ago, looked at the association between recreational or non-medical cannabis legalization, commercialization, and cannabis attributable emergency department visits in Ontario. And what they measured was these changes in cannabis attributable ED visits over time. And what they looked at, it was corresponding to different policy periods. So first they looked at legalization, which had very strict store restrictions, and then broader commercialization. And so this was legalization as well, but really with no or hardly any restrictions on it. And this latter policy period happened to overlap with the COVID-19 pandemic. And what they found was actually emergency department visits were increasing over time for cannabis pre-legalization. But then around legalization, it stopped increasing. But they found that it increased again when it moved from purely a very restrictive legalization framework to a broader commercialization framework, as well as this also overlapped with the pandemic. So, this in many ways is consistent with other literature that has shown that when a product, such as alcohol, for example, is made more widely available or commercialized, this may also have negative public health implications. And we talk a lot in public health and public health ethics and in the work that we do in healthcare about the social determinants of health. But what we're also talking about here today is a broader issue around the commercial determinants of health. And this has been defined by Kickbush and colleagues as strategies and approaches used by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. And many corporate practices can shape health through influence in various research, education, and policy processes. And if you look at the sort of corporate influences of health literature, you can see how actually many corporate practices, such as sort of lobbying and the influence, can actually, by epidemiological standards, be considered very adverse to public health. And so you see in other industries like alcohol and tobacco, sort of very high levels of promotion of an overconsumption of a physically harmful product. We see distortion of scientific research, as well as the dissemination of doubt and influence directly in the policy process through strategies such as lobbying. And there is just a mountain of evidence which suggests how industries like big pharma, big tobacco, big food, and others, have consistently engaged in the conduct and sponsorship and dissemination of scientific research. And often, we see from the literature that we know that this may lead to research findings that tend to be favorable to the interests of the sponsor. We can see how that influences research agendas. So, for example, what types of projects are funded, what questions are asked. We see as well as the shift toward product development specifically, or how those activities itself or those products themselves can be commercialized and profited off of. Again, there's an interest here in dissemination of favorable research, a suppression of unfavorable research or research that goes perhaps against the interest of the industry, and as well as creating controversy within policy, right? It's not necessarily the substance, or it's more about individual choice and responsibility, right? It's not necessarily about the broad availability of some of these products, or there's perhaps questions about the actual maybe molecules or other things within certain products that are contributing to some population health problems. And so this manufacturing of doubt or controversy is a very sort of familiar and similar tactic to industry. And I'll just turn it over to Quinn now.
Thanks, Daniel. I think when many people approach the topic of corporate sponsorship of research, our minds often go to this idea of bias. And actually, studies show that it's not a matter of quality. Often industry-funded or industry-conducted studies are as of high quality as any other kind of study. And it's not always necessarily an issue of methodological bias or manipulation of research results. It's certainly not even an issue of bad intentions or distortion in most cases. But I think what interests me most about really examining this, and regardless of the product, we see a pattern, as Daniel has pointed out, in the activities and practices of corporations, that they behave in similar ways across sectors, and that we can study these patterns to understand how these massive industries, massive companies have such influence over population health and healthy public policy. And so for me, this image really captures the nature of the effects when we have companies in an industry of this size involved in scientific research. Because as Danielle has just pointed out, it can have what I call a megaphone effect, where questions and research and lines of inquiries that are ultimately of interest to commercial entities or further commercial objectives will find a platform, will find the funding, and will find its place within policy processes and the scholarly literature. And so for us, examining the role of what is now big cannabis in sponsorship of scientific research, I think raises really critical questions about our body of knowledge that is emerging related to cannabis use and access to care, the questions of social justice and population health equity, human rights. And I think Canada provides a really unique case study in this moment, 3 years after legalization, to study the relationships among industry activities as it relates to research, and then community mental health and substance use health outcomes with research as that link. So one way to do this is to kind of map the landscape. And for us, this project is really a catalyst project in taking the first steps to really understanding what kinds of activities, what kinds of research related activities, topics are cannabis companies involved with in Canada. Dan, would you advance that for me? I don't have the control. So in our work, we study commercial determinants of health and corporate influences on health, and we've developed methods to study these corporate activities across sectors like pharmaceutical, medical device, food, and now cannabis. And it often involves triangulating several different data sources, but fortunately, corporations, as publicly traded companies often, and due to regulation, they often have a lot of very publicly available documents. And then also through their promotion and advertising, they make a lot of information publicly available through their own websites and sources and publications. So we actually started this project by relying, for example, on an industry source. New Cannabis Venture provides analyses of the cannabis market. We use databases such as Crunchbase, which is a publicly available company database that keeps track of investors and investments, acquisitions, mergers. We can look at regulatory findings in regulatory databases, relying on scholarly databases like PubMed and tools such as R. Next slide, please. And so we used PubMed in a unique way, and I want to highlight it for this audience because this is a relatively new tool that's certainly of interest to me in my work on conflicts of interest and industry sponsorship of research. Back in 2017, the PubMed, so this is the National Library of Medicine and their interface through Medline, started indexing the conflict of interest statement within biomedical articles. And in biomedicine, there has been growing recognition of the influence of conflicts of interest for researchers and the influence of study funding and some of the biases that result, which we've talked about. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors requires that journals who sign on to these recommendations require that authors make disclosures about financial ties with commercial entities that may be relevant or have relevance to their work, and also to declare the funding source for the researcher. So these kinds of statements have become more and more common in the biomedical literature, but unfortunately, they still remain often difficult to access, inconsistent, or omitting key information. They can be wildly unstandardized or sometimes missing entirely. So it was really a wonderful advance when PubMed began indexing the conflict of interest statement as part of the article's metadata in PubMed. So you can actually go to the search interface and, for example, put a cannabis company name as a search term, and it will return all articles where that company's name was disclosed within a conflict of interest or funding statement. So we made use of this, and this of course will give just a snapshot or a slice of all the activities related to research that cannabis companies are undertaking. So of course, this will be restricted to journals that are indexed by PubMed, which are largely biomedical, though we are interested in health-related research. And unfortunately, though this is a very exciting search interface, it's not a particularly specific or sensitive search engine as yet. And so we elected to search not for cannabis-related words, but for company-related words. And it doesn't quite allow you to do anything fancy like Boolean search terms and the like. So I'll kind of address some of these limitations in a minute. But if you could go to the next slide, please. So we used the search interface and had identified 42 Canadian cannabis companies using an industry publication. We put their names one by one into PubMed to generate all the conflict of interest statements that may contain those company names. We downloaded the PubMed IDs for all the articles returned in that search, extracted the metadata using R, and then have built ourselves a data set within Excel. And next. Oh, and there's animation there. So I think that's fine. You can go to the next one. Thanks, Dan. In this kind of work, we borrow a lot of methods as well from, I would say, content analyses and also systematic reviews to add rigor and transparency to our methodological processes. So we went through and created a coding manual for our variables of interest, including really the type of article, the type of conflict of interest that was disclosed, the nature of the study funding, the other cannabis companies disclosed, and then some characteristics of the research, including whether it was cannabis focused, whether it included human participants or was animal research or plant-based, the main topic or focus of the article, and then key demographics about the included human participants. And we did this in duplicate, so 2 researchers working independently for accuracy and comprehensiveness, and with disagreements settled by a 3rd researcher. And next slide. So due to the, I think, lack of specificity in the PubMed search interface, we did return a large number of potentially interesting articles, nearly 3,000. Unfortunately, you can only search one word at a time. So for example, when you put in canopy growth, the PubMed interface would pick up any conflict of interest statement that had the word canopy or the word growth. I guess there is also a cannabis company, for example, that has its Peloton Therapeutics, but we also picked up all the research that had to do with the Peloton exercise bike. So we went through and screened, and in the end, the vast majority of the articles actually did not name a cannabis company, but we identified 155 articles that included not only the 42 companies that we sought to look for, but ended up identifying 88 different companies. And what we find very typically is a conflict of interest statement will include disclosures of financial ties between the authors and multiple companies, not only cannabis, but also pharmaceutical or medical device. Interestingly, however, the disclosure statements were really dominated by a very small number of companies. So Canopy Growth and Tilray each were present in half of the sample, respectively. In our included sample of the 155, about 2/3 of them were actually empirical articles, but there were also a number of reviews and commentaries. 11% were plant or animal studies, and about 1/4 were actually interventional studies with human participants. And next, thank you. So when we examined these funding and disclosure statements, about 1/3 of our sample disclosed that they actually received research funding from a cannabis company. And this was mostly in the form of a grant or an author who was employed by the cannabis company, so research support in the form of their salary. We also found some where cannabis companies had donated product, which was required for the study, or access to data sets, for example, through retail outlets or medical cannabis clinics. Another 2/3 of articles disclosed that at least one author on the study received payments from a cannabis company for activities such as consulting, serving on advisory boards, or speaker fees. And 19% of the articles had both been funded by a cannabis company and had an author disclose a conflict of interest with a cannabis company. About half of the author teams in this study were based solely in academia, and another half were mixed. So researchers were located in academia and also in industry, government, or NGOs. And next slide, please. What we found in our sample was 87 of the 155 articles had human participants, but less than half of them had reported key demographic details such as race and ethnicity. Only about a third reported anything to do with socioeconomic status. Only 2 studies reported participants' sexual orientation. And so of the small number that did report demographics, typically this was sex and gender. And we found that the studies that reported these details, most participants identified as male and as white. Next, thanks, Dan. And we looked again at the research focus. And I think what was an interesting finding for me was, despite the cannabis funding or the disclosure of financial ties, in our sample of 155 articles, only 38, almost 40% actually had a real cannabis focus, which we define as mentioning cannabis in the title or abstract. And so I think we'll discuss this a bit later, what it means that authors have ties to cannabis companies, but are actually working in a wide variety of research fields and on really diverse research topics. And when we dug into those topics, there was, I think, exceptional diversity, but some of the prominent ones included actual studies of the safety or pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics of cannabis as a product. But also, perhaps related, but less directly, we had a number of studies that were focused on opioid use and both chronic and acute pain. And we can move to the next. So Daniel, please jump in when you're ready. I'll maybe touch on some things and you can expand on that as we move into the discussion. But I think what is interesting for us, and partly is the inspiration for the research question, but in mapping this landscape and noting some of these patterns, when you apply this perspective of corporate influences on health, and really looking at the corporation as a particular structure with a set of activities and strategies that are in common across industries, even with this little snapshot, this Canadian case study in a subset of the literature, Canadian big cannabis looks like peer industries in its research activities in terms of sponsoring or conducting research related to product development. So this is a little bit reminiscent of big food and their focus on, say, micronutrients in a breakfast cereal. You know, you've got your often fortified products for the health benefit, but also an emphasis on product safety and an attempt to demonstrate safety. We also see, maybe more akin to the pharmaceutical industry, this idea that we're looking for expanded indications of use. And in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, we often see research in the definition of a disease or diagnostic thresholds and we've been able to document in that research literature that pharmaceutical companies are often looking to widen the number of people who would be able or indicated to take a drug, expanding a market. And so perhaps I think with cannabis, when we look at the wide variety of research that cannabis companies are funding or researchers in those fields, it will be interesting to begin to map that research agenda. And then we certainly are seeing this notion of a key opinion leader. And so this is something that certainly the pharmaceutical industry, but other industries have cultivated. And a key opinion leader is someone who is really respected and usually expert in their field, either in research or clinically. And companies often seek to cultivate or partner with key opinion leaders and to provide them often a platform in terms of speaking tours, in terms of consulting, in terms of conducting peer-to-peer education. And it's not so much that these people are corrupted or are swayed or are, influenced, but rather that industry seeks out influential people who already have perspectives or research or a program that is favorable to the company's interests. And this is where we really see that megaphone effect. So often in the disclosure statements we studied, authors were disclosing ties to cannabis companies, but often ties to many other companies as well, suggesting that they're quite influential within their spaces. And I think we'll argue and hopefully seek to explore that we maybe do need more independent funding for cannabis-related mental health research. I think everyone is maybe perhaps in agreement that there is a real research gap here, and legalization provides an opportunity for people to study cannabis in a way that there's been a lot of barriers to cannabis-related research because of criminalization. And Canada is now, again, a case study, and perhaps there's really an opportunity here. But I think for us to really explore the pressing questions and priorities for public health, this funding is going to need to be independent, and we need to create mechanisms so researchers can explore these questions independently for many of the reasons we've discussed, and we can have more conversation about that. And I think, as we've seen in the calls with this report from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, the Amplifying Black Experiences in Cannabis Mental Health Research, that along with this, we also need research that will center diverse lived experiences, is representative of the communities who use and are involved in the cannabis industry, and to focus on structural issues. And this will be partly, I think, can come about through independent funding and sources. So Dan, I'll maybe let you add anything to that and take a conclusion.
For sure. Thanks, Quinn. So the couple points I want to highlight is first of all, we have seen this story before. As Dr. Grundy mentioned, we are finding, at least from our initial results, that big cannabis is behaving in very similar ways to its peer industries. We have seen how this plays out in other contexts and the population harms that this can cause. So we do have, as Dr. Grundy said, an opportunity here to really try to rethink this and change this. But a lot of this, is going to have to happen, at least structurally. So many of my colleagues at CAMH in the Institute of Mental Health Policy have argued around cannabis. Cannabis is not classified in sort of in the same way as alcohol is. And, we can't do research on things like edibles. We can't purchase cannabis from the Ontario Cannabis Store and do research on it in the same way. So what happens is researchers are relying on industry to provide, the products, to provide sort of the research questions and the funding. And so there's a massive sort of systemic issue here that we're highlighting that relates all the way from the structural level all the way down to the micro level around conflicts of interest. And this permeates other areas as well. We haven't talked much about sort of big medical cannabis, but we can also see that happening as well in terms of corporate influences on other professions too, like pharmacists, for example, and their role in other in distributing medical cannabis or advising on different distributors. So, I think this is really sort of what we're highlighting. We have a really interesting case study here, given, as Dr. Grundy mentioned, given like the recent legalization in Canada, and I think an opportunity to do things and think about things a bit differently, so we can hopefully this time sort of learn from our past mistakes. As I mentioned, this is the first phase of a two-phase project. Our next phase, which has recently been launched, is we're conducting qualitative semi-structured interviews with clinicians and researchers, including peer researchers. So these are people who identify as having a lived experience of substance use, for example, who are actively working as within research teams on their perspectives towards cannabis legalization and the financial sponsorship of scientific research. And these interviews actually are informed directly from the findings of our first phase. And we also have a particular focus on the experience of Black researchers who have been working in the space, and advocates who have been long advocating for cannabis amnesty and equity and reform. And this is led by our colleague, Dr. Roberta Timothy. So I will end there. Thank you all so much for listening, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Quinn and Daniel. For those of you watching on YouTube, it's now an opportunity to ask questions and put your comments in the YouTube chat. I see some people have done that already. To make the comments in the YouTube chat, I think you need to be logged in. So if that's not something that you'd like to do or able to do, you also have the option to send questions and have them asked anonymously, and you can send an email with your question to jcb.ea@utoronto.ca. And I think Terry's put that in the YouTube chat for you as well. Okay. So I'm gonna open up my Google Doc here and see the questions we have. So maybe we can start with, I'm just curious and about sort of if you want to start by saying anything about the funding for your work and your research team is doing. I think I missed if there was sort of a declaration of where the funding for this particular work that you're doing was coming from. So it might be worth sort of starting there and expanding on that.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. So we mentioned it at the beginning of the talk. So the funding for this study was provided by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and it is a Catalyst grant on cannabis.
So we have a question asking if you could say a bit more about the ethical concerns around the studies that didn't mention cannabis. So in the research you did, I think, Quinn, you alluded to some thoughts that you had and you wanted the opportunity to expand on later. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just focus, and I think this was interesting to us when we looked at the studies that disclosed funding from a cannabis company or authors who had financial ties to a cannabis company. I think we were a bit surprised that many of the articles on the face of it were not really about cannabis. On the face of it. And so I think there's not necessarily like an ulterior agenda here, but I think this is worth investigation and is perhaps a line of inquiry for future work. And so, for example, what we've seen in peer industries, like pharmaceutical companies, for example, not all research they sponsor or not all researchers that they have consulting or advisory relationships with is about a particular product that they have on the market now. So I think the question is, what kinds of fields of research, what kinds of areas of focus are researchers involved with who also have ties and relationships to cannabis company? And it could be completely ancillary that someone, consults for a cannabis company and then has this completely different program of research in an unrelated area. But what I think we're seeing are articles that have a focus on substance use more broadly. So, we mentioned that opioid use and other substance abuse and addiction is an area of focus, certainly pain. And none of them may have referenced cannabis explicitly in the title or abstract, but these are certainly areas where cannabis may have an application or an indication or relevance, and where it's perhaps unclear in these early stages what the research agenda is. I think we also see in disclosure statements often, researchers who work with industry can work with a whole host of companies, have a very large number of ties. And so the utility of a disclosure statement, I think, does come into question. And for me, and we study this, we're often missing the relevance piece. So authors are asked to disclose any companies, commercial entities that they have ties with, but it's not communicated to the reader the nature of that relationship, the value of the payment, the reason for the payment. And I think this is something in terms of transparency that could really advance our understanding of the impact of these kinds of relationships.
So we do have a comment that connects with the thoughts you just shared there, and I'm wondering if you want to say a bit more about it. So Brenda shared that disclosure is essential but not sufficient. So big pharma or cannabis, whatever it is so ubiquitous that disclosure could serve to normalize conflict of interest. And I heard you suggest that maybe some more information about what the nature of that relationship is could be helpful. Is there anything you want to add, or any thoughts on sort of that normalization, the risk of that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. And I couldn't agree more. I think honestly, that disclosure and the PubMed interface, while transparency was often justified as being of value to a public or to readers, I think honestly, it's most valuable to people like us who are interested in delving into these data to empirically establish patterns and to understand how this works across research fields and across companies. I think as the commenter points out, there is research to suggest that it can have unintended effects, particularly in healthcare. We know that when patients receive disclosures from their health professionals, that sometimes it can cause them to trust biased advice even more, or certainly normalizing it. I do, though, I think really believe in the value of transparency, and there are initiatives around the world to really increase this. And I think at the moment, its value is for researchers, for journalists, but as a precursor, I think, to measures that require kind of more accountability and to understand what these relationships really mean, rather than just putting it out and kind of saying, reader beware.
Andrew asks if there are any patterns of investors or leadership demographics in the C-suite board of the big cannabis companies.
I'll sort of take a first attempt at this. So we haven't done in our particular sample, a deep dive into some of those questions, but I'll first say they remain extremely interesting to us. We want to understand sort of who is dominating the industry, from factors such as gender and racialized identities and other sort of identities, particularly in context of histories of criminalization, prohibition, and racism within cannabis. And also, from a perspective of equitable access to markets, right? A lot of folks who've been disproportionately criminalized, like Black people who've been disproportionately criminalized from cannabis, have not necessarily accessed those benefits of legalization, right? So I say this not because we've necessarily mined this within our own data, but this is from what we're learning from some elsewhere in the literature about who's the major investors, and also who's sort of at those C-suite levels of major cannabis corporations, not necessarily just in Canada, but elsewhere in North America as well, and internationally.
So I have a few questions. So I'm wondering, so in terms of the sort of legalization structure in Canada, we have like in Ontario, the government cannabis stores. There are also a lot of cannabis stores that are not under that sort of umbrella, and people go to and obtain it sort of differently. So I'm wondering how that kind of gray market or black market model that is out in the open now, how that fits into the sort of commercialization aspect of health, the commercialization determinants of health. So if you have any thoughts on that. And then related to that, I'm curious about sort of some of the research questions you might have in mind, if you do have anything in mind from a mental health perspective, like things that you like to see and maybe are more likely with independent funding for cannabis research.
I can jump in, Danielle, on the first part. In terms of the black and gray market, there certainly is a literature within corporate influences on health. And when we look at industries, particularly like the tobacco industry has long tried to draw attention to, for example, the black market for cigarettes. And I think sometimes this can be a bit of a red herring. And it's something, again, that you see corporations quite interested in this issue, because I think for them it's an issue of competition, and also a way to portray the legal corporate industry as more credible, safer, and to obviously have control over their market. So I don't know at the moment where the cannabis conversation or focus will go in terms of gray and black market. And certainly in terms of our study, I am not aware whether the black or gray market companies are conducting or sponsoring research. And I think that would probably fall outside of our sampling frame, but would be certainly interesting. In terms of research questions that we would like to see, I actually am not a cannabis researcher. So my area of focus is really understanding corporate influences on health and healthcare. And so using our methods and using our theory to really understand this emerging space and the health impacts. I know, Dan, this maybe touches more on your area, so maybe I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. I mean, I think there's tons of wonderful opportunities. I think we can explore these questions from an ethics perspective. I would, again, refer folks back to the Amplifying Black Experiences document in terms of some key recommendations in there for especially community-driven research to point to. I mean, I think there's many obviously ethical dimensions or moral dimensions within that. I'm also interested in questions around cannabis and harm reduction, and how industry interfaces there. There's been tons of wonderful cannabis, like social science cannabis research that's been done even during Prohibition as well, particularly with youth. So there's folks across Canada who are doing some of that amazing work already. I'm interested even in sort of building on sort of this framework here and understanding how this expands to potentially other sort of emerging legal markets, and where that dovetails or resonates as well. So, again, we're not necessarily interested in cannabis as a substance, but and both the benefits and the risks that come with the substance. That's not in our focus. But I think there's a lot of interesting things to consider sort of within that. But also there's a lot of everyday ethical issues that do come up with the substance itself that many of my bioethics colleagues across Toronto and the country, and even probably also like in North America, are managing every day in terms of negotiating patient cannabis use for medicinal reasons and hospital policies against, let's say, smoking or religious liberties and freedoms and the use of cannabis in healthcare settings, and how that might be in tension with hospital policies. Perceptions of cannabis as a substance, as a legal substance, versus, let's say, alcohol or tobacco. So it's, I think there's a lot of wonderful opportunities here to do some great work. Any students who are very interested, I'm sure Quinn and I would be willing to speak with you.
It's a great offer. I hope they take you up on it. I'm also wondering, with the cannabis companies that you were looking at and finding in this work, were they sort of independent cannabis companies in the sense that they were only sort of they're a parent company just with cannabis, or were they subsidiaries of other things like tobacco companies or pharma companies? I wonder about sort of what the relationships might be in the background of some of the companies. Do you have any insight into that?
Yes. And actually the answer is yes to all those questions. And I think even I can speak at this point of time, but one of the things I think that has surprised us, or a challenge in this particular field. So we're applying methods we've used in looking at practices in other industries, but this cannabis market and industry is changing so quickly. You open the news every week and there's a new merger, there's a new acquisition. And so we first went to an industry publication and identified kind of 42 main cannabis companies, but even that took some sleuthing, because the corporate structure often means there is some sort of umbrella or parent company that then has multiple subsidiaries, and many cannabis companies are what you'd call vertically integrated. So they might own their own grower and their processor and their clinic and their retail outlet. There's also a whole swath of the cannabis industry that are just growers or just distributors. And so we were looking specifically at companies that would have research activities, so tended to be more vertically integrated. But to even run the search and research sponsorship and ties with researchers tend to happen more centrally within companies and not so much at their subsidiaries. But we first had to kind of group all the companies we identified into what we call families, so by shared ownership. So looking at the parent companies. But when we went and found the disclosure statements, we identified so many more cannabis companies that we weren't even looking for, we hadn't searched for, that were also in those disclosure statements. Cannabis industry is interesting because we have companies that are focused only on medical cannabis as a product, others that are only non-medical, and some that have divisions that do both. And so there certainly are some of the cannabis companies that are subsidiaries or parents or are parts of pharmaceutical companies. There is really a variety. And then I think even as we are preparing our analysis for publication, we may have to reanalyze these data because they have since merged and acquired and gone bust, and it's a very rapidly evolving space. So it can be kind of challenging for research purposes when you're doing something cross-sectional to pin that down.
Really interesting, thank you.
Sorry, the latest one was a merger with an alcohol company even. So all of it.
It's probably not too surprising, but really interesting. I didn't know how fast it was evolving and moving. One of the things I wonder is if the public perceptions of cannabis companies or big cannabis, particularly with the blurring of the markets, like the black market, gray market, if it's different than big pharma and big tobacco, because it's newer, because of the history of sort of recent legalization. So hopefully somebody does that work. Do you guys have any thoughts on sort of public perception? I know it's still new, but public perception, at least in Canada, of big cannabis?
I think that's an important question. And I think I think that's a great empirical question that we need to know a little bit more about.
I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions that have come in yet through Google. Just a reminder, if you do have a question, oh, Terry is cutting and pasting it. All right, we'll wait for him to do that. So apologies to the audience. We've got a framework where we're cutting and pasting from YouTube into a Google Doc. Okay, so someone asks if there's any research being done on how big cannabis is targeting populations experiencing vulnerability, such as the ill, injured military service members and veterans. Thanks for that question.
Yeah. So I think we will hopefully be able to pull this out. I mean, this was a bit our intention in trying to map this landscape. We were interested in, who were the human participants in these cannabis-funded studies, with attention to vulnerability, marginalization, but also like diverse demographics. And I think as we finalize our analysis, we'd like to delve a little bit deeper into exactly who these studies recruited and included. And I think, particular categories of people. I think what surprised us was how poorly demographic information was reported, and that often the population and had to be a little bit inferred, or the only thing we could really learn about them is their sex or gender. Sometimes it's difficult to know whether they assess sex or gender, just reported in certain ways. So I don't know that we'll be able to, have a lot of certainty around this, but I think that's, as we do our analysis, want to dig a little bit more into who were in these studies. I don't know if you want to add into that, Dan.
I'll just say that, again, nothing more to add to what Quinn is saying in terms of the specifics of our sample, although I think it's really important that we learn about this and try to tease that out. I mean, we do know from other industries, such as tobacco, that there have been sponsorship of or financial sponsorship of things like homeless shelters, for example, or targeting specific groups where sort of a disproportionate number of the population tends to smoke. So, there is that specifically. So that has been done in other industries. I can't say if that has been done in cannabis at all. in terms of that kind of sponsorship. That's not research sponsorship; it's a bit different types of sponsorship. But given what we know, how the industry is at least some preliminary evidence of how the industry is starting to behave, it wouldn't necessarily be surprising if certain other corporate activities followed similar trajectories.
So we've only got a few minutes left in our session, and I thought I would just turn it over to you to share any final thoughts, anything that you found surprising and want to emphasize, or anything else you'd like to tell us about the future of your research, so the next steps.
I think for me, part of my interest in doing this kind of work is, corporations are extremely dominant in our world. And I think there's some interesting things happening in terms of corporations looking at their corporate social responsibility, looking at their own diversity and representation and engagement with those groups. But I think ultimately, and the ideal for me is that we can start to imagine different ways of doing this. So as Daniel said, we're not really taking a position here on cannabis, but to examine corporate practices to understand it, but also to think about, are there other models? Are there other ways that we could have a legal cannabis industry that actually promote public health, that promote health equity, that promote reparations? Because I think there's now a large body of evidence that suggests the corporate structure itself can create health and equity-related harms. And so I think for us, maybe ultimately, or as we build our program of research, is to ask those questions and think about, can we structure this differently?
And I would, for me, I'm similarly interested in from a bioethics perspective, not just in how corporations are, shaping health and health outcomes and mental health and substance use health outcomes, but just the idea of conflicts of interest or financial conflicts of interest as a population health ethics issue. And I think, there's been a lot of work and, done on conflicts of interest in terms of things like prescribing. But I think we need to look also broader institutional conflicts of interest. And we need to look at sort of these, we got to sort of, my interest is sort of at that broader sort of systemic structural level in terms of the role of conflicts of interest. And, thinking about it, as Dr. Grundy said, sort of in context of health and human rights and health equity. And really, it's not about bad actors, but and to paraphrase a wonderful podcast, which I will recommend, which is looking at these issues in the psychedelic industry, which is it's called Cover Story by New York Magazine, which is horrible, but also horrible and tragic what they talk about, but also incredibly important. They say it's not a bunch of bad apples, it's a bad orchard. And so sort of looking at the roots and looking at these broader systems and how they relate to ethical issues such as conflict of interest, I think is really important.
Thanks so much. This is really fantastic work, and I'm looking forward to getting updates as you go through this research project. So thank you for sharing. Unfortunately, it's time to draw today's seminar to a close. And I do have a couple of announcements to make before I thank you both. So as I mentioned at the beginning, so this is our final seminar session for 2021-2022 seminar series. And thank you to everyone for participating virtually this year. We'll be back in September of 2022 for a new academic year. To sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails, please send an email to jcb.info@utoronto.ca. For the CSB students enrolled in the CSB student seminar course, please remember to keep track of your attendance. And finally, Quinn and Daniel, on behalf of all of us here today, thank you very much for your presentation. We hope to see you all again in September. Thanks.
Thank you.